Good morning. As present provost of the University of Chicago, it's my great pleasure to welcome you here to celebrate the life and contributions of the first provost of the University of Chicago, Edward Levi, who assumed this office 50 years ago. In reflecting about the university, Levi wrote, "The University of Chicago, in all probability, could not be created today. The task would be too great and beyond reach. But the university can be refounded and recreated, as is the necessity for all institutions if they are to endure. The challenge to the university and its friends is to carry forward for our time this extraordinary tradition and instrument, which began all at once, assumed a unique combination of research, teaching, and professional training, and over its history has departed very little from the values it seeks. Perhaps this is why it carries also that magical sense of wholeness." Our panelists today will speak about this magic, the magic of Edward Levi's accomplishments and the university he loved, and paint a picture of the whole individual. We're privileged to be able to gather together in this way and to, in fact, have Geoffrey Stone, who, like Levi, was dean of the law school and provost of the university, to moderate this assembly. Jeff is a distinguished constitutional law expert. He is a co-editor of the Supreme Court Review, and he is the Edward H. Levi Distinguished Service Professor. Jeff.
Thank you, Tom, and welcome to all of you. I want to just offer one brief reminiscence of Edward. When President Hannah Gray invited me in January of 1987 to serve as dean of the law school, I knew that I was going to accept, but I thought I should, before formally accepting, consult with several people, at least for the appearance of the consultation. And first on that list was Edward Levi, and I asked Edward to have lunch with me. And we sat down for lunch, and I said, "Edward, President Gray has invited me to serve as dean of the law school. What do you think? Should I accept?" And he looked at me and said, "When were you born?" And I said, "November 20th. And he said, "What year?" And I said, 1946. And he thought for a moment, and he said, "Yes." And I thought, what is this, astrology? It was only much later when it occurred to me to go check, and it turned out that Edward wanted to be sure that he would still be the youngest dean of the law school. And I wondered what he would have said if I had said I was born in 1947. But also in that lunch, Edward revealed a characteristic that was so present in him, because after he gave me that single answer, for the next 45 minutes or so, I asked a series of questions. What do you think about the current state of the law school? What is it that the law school needs these days? What should be the relationship between the dean and the provost? He did not offer a single declarative sentence. In response to every question, he would say, "Well, what do you think about this?" And it was so Socratic, so typically Edward, that in the end, I don't know if I learned very much except that I didn't know anything. But at the end, Edward finally, in a straight way, answered a question, and I've never forgotten the answer, and I've offered it many times to other people because it was so brilliant and also so completely captured Edward. I said to him at the end, "What makes for a great dean?" And he suddenly changed his focus. And instead of answering, "What do you think makes a great dean?" he said to me, "A great dean radiates the values of the institution." And that immediately struck me as not only amazing advice, but also a perfect characterization of Edward in his own form of leadership. That one always understood what Edward thought of his institution, and he reaffirmed that and ratified that in everything he said and everything that he did. Okay, so Edward wore many hats at the University of Chicago. He was a brilliant teacher, a creative scholar, an inspiring dean, and innovative provost, and a courageous and highly principled president. And throughout his career, he both reaffirmed and refined the very best values of our university. Of course, eventually Edward deserted our university to serve as Attorney General of the United States at a critical time in our nation's history. And again, in that post-Watergate world, he reaffirmed and refined the very best values, this time, of our nation. In this morning's session, we'll hear from four very distinguished speakers, each of whom will address a different facet of Edward's career. Our first speaker, Dennis Hutchinson, the William Rainey Harper Professor in the college and senior lecturer in the law school, will discuss Edward's contributions as a legal scholar. Among his many achievements, Dennis had the unique distinction of serving as a law clerk to not one, but to two Supreme Court justices, Byron White and William Douglas. Like Edward, Dennis is a man of many hats. At the university, he's associated not only with the college and the law school, but also with the history department, the Committee on Ideas and Methods, and the college program in Law, Letters, and Society, which he chairs. Since 1981, Dennis has served as editor of the Supreme Court Review, which was founded by Edward Levi when he was dean. And Dennis's 1998 book, which was a portrait of Justice Byron White, was named the New York Times Notable Book of the Year. Our second speaker, Larry Kramer, will discuss Edward as a teacher and mentor. Larry is a graduate of our law school, and while a student here, he took elements of the law from Edward and also served as Edward's research assistant. He was also, by the way, one of my favorite students ever. Actually, he was probably, in fact, my favorite student ever, but don't tell Larry that. After graduating from law school, Larry went on for a clerkship with Supreme Court Justice William Brennan, a position on the faculty at the University of Chicago Law School, eventually the deanship of Stanford Law School, and now the presidency of the Hewlett Foundation. Following in Edward's footsteps, Larry is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a member of the American Philosophical Society, and a member of the American Law Institute. Larry's 2004 book, The People Themselves, Popular Constitutionalism and Judicial Review, is one of the most influential books in the field of law in the 21st century. Our third speaker, John Boyer, is the Martin A. Ryerson Distinguished Service Professor in History and Dean of the College, a position John has held for time immemorial. John will discuss Edward's role as a university leader. John received his PhD from the university in 1975 and joined the faculty that very year. He served as editor of the Journal of Modern History since 1980. He's published several books, including Political Radicalism in Late Imperial Vienna. He was co-author of the 9-volume University of Chicago Readings in Western Civilization, and he's currently writing a comprehensive history of the University of Chicago. John regularly teaches European civilization in the college, as well as courses on religion and politics in modern European history. During his tenure as leader of the college, John, in my judgment, has established himself as the most influential dean in the history of the University of Chicago College. Our final speaker this morning, Jack Fuller, is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. During his journalistic career, Jack has served as a police reporter, a war correspondent in Vietnam, and a Washington correspondent. From 1989 to 2005, he served as editor of the Chicago Tribune, publisher of the Chicago Tribune, and president of the Tribune Publishing Company, not all at the same time. Jack has written 7 novels and 2 books on journalism, including his 2010 book, What is Happening to News: The Information Explosion and the Crisis in Journalism. Jack's been a member of the board of the University of Chicago since 1994. A graduate of the Yale Law School, Jack served as special assistant to Attorney General Edward Levi during the administration of President Ford, and he will speak this morning about that facet of Edward's career. Jack has recently edited a volume of Edward Levy's speeches when he was Attorney General, aptly titled Restoring Justice, which will be published by the University of Chicago Press next spring. Thank you, and Dennis, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jeff. It's a real pleasure to be here this morning. It's a delight to see so many members of the Levi family here. Edward Hirsch Levi was a scholar by heritage, by training, and by inclination. The son and grandson of rabbis, lifelong resident of Hyde Park, he was identified with the institutions that educated him and that he in turn shaped: the lab school, the college, the law school, and finally the university as provost and president. The career arc is so familiar and the achievements so indelible that it is hard to imagine that the trajectory was anything but inevitable. But in many respects, his professional career did not take direction or focus until he left Chicago after graduating in 1935 from the law school to spend a year as a Sterling Fellow at the Yale Law School. That year exposed him to a species of legal scholarship he had not encountered before and provided him mentors, colleagues, and an intellectual agenda. More than any other experience, the time at Yale supplied the foundation for what he did when he returned to teach at Chicago and eventually what he tried to do as dean of the law school. When Edward Levi arrived at Yale in the fall of 1935, he must have experienced an intellectual jolt. The Chicago curriculum is quite traditional, with a bit of economics available, but otherwise unchanged for a decade. In sharp contrast, Yale between the wars was a hotbed of iconoclasm, an epicenter of the so-called American legal realist movement. In its simplest and most extreme forms, legal realism rejected the idea of law as a system of rules logically developed and applied. Rather, legal decisions were seen as the products of personal and political bias, presented in syllogistic form. The formal opinions were said to be really no more than post hoc rhetorical exercises. In the classroom, this meant that rules and doctrine were deconstructed to reveal their irrationality. Every member of the Yale faculty did not align with the realists, and there was a variety of subspecies. Some tried to develop empirical studies of how the law affected business and society. Some urged emphasis on psychology or even anthropology as lenses for understanding the operation of legal institutions. And some were nihilists, with no faith in the capacity of language to control social behavior or to achieve consistent results. Edward Levi allied himself with no camp, although he was deeply influenced by two members of the Yale faculty, Roscoe Steffens and Thurman Arnold. Steffens had taught commercial law at Yale since 1925, 5 years after receiving his LLB there. He taught at the University of Chicago Law School in the summer of 1934, where he met Levi, who was a year away from graduating. Steffen wrote extensively, particularly in the area of commercial law. He also advocated changes in legal curricula and teaching materials. Although Steffen's work was identified with a realist approach, he was, at best, a fellow traveler. He agreed that law was not a set of static principles, but a dynamic institution that needed to be studied in connection with the social institutions which it serves in order to be understood. Steffen's approach, emphasizing practicality but sensitive to broad intellectual perspectives, appealed strongly to Levi. And during his year at Yale, they collaborated on a set of teaching materials designed to show the nature of legal development in a broad-gauged historical context. The materials emphasized two overriding themes: the influence of social and political theory outside the legal system on the system's behavior, and the incremental, sometimes unself-conscious development of new legal principles. If the traditional emphasis in first-year law school courses was on the science of making deductions from legal rules, the Levi-Steffen approach taught that the important problems in law involve making a choice between rules, and doing so in a deliberated, disciplined fashion. Roscoe Steffens was a collaborator, but not a mentor. That title properly belongs to Thurman Arnold. In 1939, when he became head of the Antitrust Division, the Saturday Evening Post described him as a large, somewhat paunchy, middle-aged man with overflowing human gusto, who looks like a small-town storekeeper and talks like a native Rabelais. His costume is disheveled, his voice is loud, his exaggerations are gargantuan. His energy appears to be completely uncontrolled. Indeed, he seems at first to be another Marx brother strayed into the government by mistake. Despite the polar contrast in style and effect between Arnold and Levi, the two men became friends literally from the first day. Arnold's writing skewered legal and economic rhetoric as nothing more than symbolism and ritual. Levi met Arnold in his first class at Yale. As a graduate student, he was required to take a seminar entitled Psychological Basis for the Law. Outside of faculty earshot, students called the course the Cave of the Winds. The first assignment was proofs of Arnold's new book, The Symbols of Government, whose major point, Levi later said, was that a preoccupation with principles, rules, and logic had resulted in an adherence to the past, such as the natural law, with the consequences that law was not responsive to the needs of society. Levi later recounted how Arnold threw him out of the seminar for pointing out in detail contradictions in the proofs. A post-class rapprochement allowed Levi, 20 years younger than Arnold, to say later, from that moment on, we were friends, and we became, I think, close friends. It would be wrong to suggest that Levi was either torn between Stephan's practicality and Arnold's seat-of-the-pants anthropology, for want of a better term, or that he ignored the conflict between the two. A year after the first class, Levi wrote a remarkably candid letter to Arnold in a tone of both confidence and intimacy. Referring to the Levi-Stephens materials, Levi said, "I don't think Mr. Stephens yet realizes how much along the lines of symbols of government it is. He has his own symbols, and so have we." In 1936, Edward Levi returned to the law school on a joint appointment as assistant professor and librarian. During the 18 months he was at Yale, he was quite prolific, publishing or finishing 3 law review articles, 4 co-authored articles, 1 set of teaching materials, and 1 co-authored treatise. One of the articles staked out his own position on the realist movement and suggested a third way between Stephan and Arnold. Levi had set himself off from the more extreme realist in an essay published in 1938 entitled The Natural Law, Precedent, and Thurman Arnold. In a patient and self-conscious way, Levi focused on Arnold and accused him of being a closet natural lawyer whose descriptions of legal reasoning tended to the mystical and whose prescriptions were circular. Although Levi claimed to be reconciling the 3 approaches to law, natural law, precedent, and the Thurman Arnold way, the essay, in fact, anticipates in argument and presentation his famous monograph, published a decade later as An Introduction to Legal Reasoning. In 1938, Thurman Arnold was appointed Assistant Attorney General for the Antitrust Division, and in 1940, he hired Edward Levi as his first assistant. Levy's views of the antitrust laws and the evils they were designed to address or could be adapted to meet flowed largely from Thurman Arnold. After Arnold was appointed a federal judge in 1943, Levi also served as first assistant in the War Division and was special assistant to Attorney General Francis Biddle. The University of Chicago Law School had a near-death experience during World War II, as enrollments plummeted and university facilities were commandeered for training programs and supporting the armed services. President Robert Maynard Hutchins even considered closing the law school in 1943 when the graduating class dropped to 9. When Edward Levi returned to the faculty in 1945, enrollments were on the rebound and the GI Bill was providing welcome financial support for returning veterans. He became an admired classroom teacher and a prolific writer, turning out numerous occasional papers and pamphlets, 3 articles, and a new edition of Elements of the Law in the 5 years before he became dean. By far, the most important publication and what established his enduring stature in legal thought was An Introduction to Legal Reasoning, first published as a 74-page law review article in 1948, and later in a slim, hardbound edition. The monograph was a careful, sustained treatment of the issues that he first addressed a decade before in the Elements materials and course. Levi examined examples of cases treating statutes, common law, and the Constitution. The argument begins with a bold claim. It is important that the mechanism of legal reasoning should not be concealed by its pretense. The pretense is that the law is a system of known rules applied by a judge. Levi points out that the basic pattern of legal reasoning is reasoning by example. It is reasoning from case to case. It is a 3-step process described by the doctrine of precedent in which a proposition descriptive of the first case is made into a rule of law and then applied to the next similar situation. The steps are these. Similarity is seen between cases. Next, the rule inherent in the first case is announced. Then the rule is made applicable to the second case. This is a method of reasoning necessary for the law, but it has characteristics which under other circumstances might be seen as imperfections. The imperfections inhere in the nature of classification between steps, or as Levi says, the kind of reasoning involved in the legal process is one in which the classification changes as the classification is made. The rules change as the rules are applied. More important, the rules arise out of a process which, while comparing fact situation, creates the rules and then applies them. Throughout the work, Levi emphasizes the process of legal reasoning. A controversy as to whether law is certain, unchanging, and expressed in rules, or uncertain, changing, and only a technique for deciding specific cases misses the points. It is both. At the end of this tour of cases, the conclusion repeats that the emphasis should be on process. The contrast between logic and the actual legal method is a disservice to both. Legal reasoning has a logic of its own. The cogency of Edward Levy's densely presented, highly detailed argument rests on the strength of the examples he uses to establish his thesis. At its best, the work demonstrates that a precedent of one era may look different in another era if the consequences of applying the first rule have changed. For example, what seems only potentially dangerous in one era may seem obviously dangerous in another, or when more is known. In any event, what Levi depicts are still the common methods and practices of the Anglo-American legal system. The work is a direct response to the more corrosive and cynical strains of the legal realist movement, which after World War II was almost invisible. Yet the Supreme Court's sharp reversal on the scope of federal and state power in the late 1930s rekindled the question of the imperfections, indeed subjectivity, of legal reasoning. To Levi, that jeopardized the rule of law. He believed that the quality of justice depended on the integrity of the law upon which it was based. If he hoped to reassure the public, lay and professional, that the law was autonomous, based on rough and ready process with its own distinctive integrity, not all were convinced. The central problem was his claim that in cases where there are competing precedents, or where the analogies do not provide clear direction, the process is one in which the ideas of the community and of the social sciences, whether correct or not, as they win acceptance in the community, control legal decisions. He never explains precisely what the mechanism is for this intervention of public opinion, but he observes that words change to receive content which the community gives them. He seems to concede that the Supreme Court's behavior in the 1930s is an example of what he's describing, but who decides to absorb public opinion in the process, and when, is left unsaid. To some, this lapse begs the question. Nonetheless, the work has enjoyed enduring influence, perhaps, as Cass Sunstein has suggested, because the ambiguous democratic component of the analytical process is there. Levy's achievement consisted of providing a compact, accessible map of the legal argumentative process that was accessible to students and reassuring in its conclusions. In fact, the work has a curious history. It almost was not published in book form. Robert Maynard Hutchins refused a $750 subvention to support its publication. Despite the lavish dust jacket appreciations provided by his friends, reviews were politely approving at best. Nonetheless, the book has sold more than 200,000 copies since it was first published in 1949, and 90,000 copies in the last quarter century. Despite the work's durability, an introduction to legal reasoning plays little role in the recent uptick of books on the topic. The reason seems to be that it is dated, not only chronologically, but culturally. The comforting assurances about the role of the ideas of the community ring hollow after Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, Roe v. Wade in 1973, and Bush v. Gore in 2000. Nonetheless, an introduction to legal reasoning remains on many undergraduate and professional school reading lists throughout the country. The introduction needs to be understood, I think, as a template of Edward Levy's view of legal education. He believed that the classroom should scrutinize the process of adjudication, that the inquiry should be richly informed, both historically and philosophically, and that law school had distinctive roles to contribute to the further education of lawyers and to sophisticated analysis of the urgent social issues of the day. Levi the legal scholar cannot be separated from Levi the legal educator. They are all of a piece. In fact, after Levi became dean, his own scholarship became almost equally divided between his continuing interest in trade regulation law and his growing evangelism for reforming legal education. His teaching, particularly the famous antitrust course he taught with Aaron Director, included efforts to integrate economics and other social sciences into traditional law school courses. When the introduction was published, the law school was undergoing one of its periodic crises that arose during the 1940s and mid-1950s. A new curriculum had recently been adopted, but by coincidence, 3 full professors were leaving the faculty between 1947 and 1950. Core topics could not be covered and teaching loads were stretched. A faculty committee recommended to Hutchins that at least 2 new lateral appointments be made, but only Roscoe Steffen, still at Yale, came. He was named in May 1949 as the John P. Wilson Professor at a salary higher than that of the dean. Almost simultaneously, Dean Wilbur Kotz resigned and new tensions developed. For Hutchins, the deanship was an opportunity to make another big publicity splash to bracket the Steffen appointment, but sentiment within the faculty was almost uniform. Levi was their choice. In fact, the only holdout initially was Steffen, who wrote Hutchins in February 1950 that he was not yet persuaded that we have wholly exhausted the possibility of getting someone from the outside who not only would bring strength to the school in some particular field, but who would show clearly that the school is not limited to teaching lawyers' law for lawyers. Hutchins replied, "My position is that I want Ed unless we can really strengthen the faculty by a man from the outside. I doubt very much if such a man can be found. I want to make sure. In the process of making sure, I shall become more convincing when I do recommend Ed." The faculty committee unanimously endorsed Levi for dean in late February, but Hutchins was unmoved. More suggestions were made from the outside. A new 5-man committee was formed in June, and again, Levi was unanimously recommended. Nothing happened until late August, when Hutchins sent a day letter to Levi informing him that the trustees had approved his appointment as dean effective September 1st, with a $2,000 salary raise. It later emerged that some trustees had vigorously resisted Levi's appointment for nakedly anti-Semitic reasons, and that Hutchins was reported to have threatened to resign if the appointment was blocked. Indeed, Levi, age 39, was the first Jewish dean of a major American law school, and in retrospect, later said to be the most notable appointment made during his presidency. Edward Levy's appointment coincided with a new enrollment crisis. After 1 month in his new position, he informed the Central Administration that law school applications have declined at an alarming rate. 2 years before, Chicago and Northwestern each received approximately 350 applications. Since then, Northwestern's application rate held steady, but Chicago's declined to 280 and 172, and Levi noted, of this number, 45 students who were admitted later withdrew their applications. The failure to attract students from the country is probably a more significant reason for worry than the immediate decline in the number of applications. Levi recommended authorizing 20 full tuition scholarships to be awarded each year to distinguished graduates of 20 specified colleges throughout the country. The strategy was to develop the geographic base and instill a tradition that would sustain itself. That and improving the reputation of the school were complementary tactics. A month later, Edward Levi put in motion his plan to enlarge the faculty, relying on Hutchins' promise of 3 new faculty lines if he accepted the deanship. He knew that Carl Llewellyn, the Betts Professor of Jurisprudence at Columbia and author of the Bramble Bush, and one of the most prolific of the interwar legal realists, and his wife, Zoya Menshikov, might be receptive to joint appointments in Chicago. Llewellyn enjoyed a national reputation now largely as a commercial lawyer and the father of the Uniform Commercial Code, in which Miss Menshikov, who had recently had a visiting appointment at Harvard, was also deeply involved. Levi arranged for the law school to host a conference on the code and invited Llewellyn to speak at a luncheon at the University Club, where he was introduced to 32 leaders of the Chicago bar, including several distinguished alumni. During the lunch, Levi privately proposed the joint move, and after protracted but amiable wrangling over terms, the deal was closed in the spring. Levi could offer what Columbia and Harvard, also interested in the couple, could not: permanent appointments for both. Columbia and Harvard both had anti-nepotism appointment policies. Levi finessed a similar policy in Chicago by securing an appointment as professorial lecturer for Miss Menchikov. Although technically such appointments required annual review and renewal, Levi assured Llewellyn that the intention of the law faculty and of the central administration, as made known to the law faculty, is that her contract will be renewed from year to year. The third authorized hire was not as easy for the new dean, and the negotiations with the central administration, not the candidate, revealed the law school's increasingly precarious position in the university and also Levi's shrewd tactical skills. Despite the trio of distinguished appointments over the past 2 years, law school enrollments did not stabilize, and the university faced growing financial stringencies. The neighborhood was deteriorating, and students were chronically felt under threat. By 1952, Hyde Park had the highest crime rate in the city. Levi convinced the law school faculty to appoint Allison Dunham, a 36-year-old property scholar at Columbia with impeccable CV, distinguished academic record, followed by a clerkship with Chief Justice Harlan Fiske Stone, and an impending casebook that revitalized teaching of property by combining historical foundations with modern planning and development issues. Dunham's appointment almost foundered, in part because of the university's increasingly strained financial condition, and in part because of an administrative interregnum caused by Hutchins' announcement in December of 1950 that he was resigning to become associate director of the Ford Foundation. With no chancellor in place, the final administrative decision on appointment fell to President E.C. Colwell, the former dean of the Divinity School. Levi pressed hard for Dunham. "I assume that there is no doubt that in normal times this appointment ought to be made. The number and quality of the faculty needs strengthening." He added that the impending drain on enrollment caused by the draft should not defeat the appointment, because when the numbers improved, the law school could not afford to have a second-class faculty. This is an area where the financial consequences of not being recognized as outstanding are much more serious than the additional payments required to strengthen the school. Levi admitted that the law school has many problems: a student body not nearly as good nor as numerous as it should be, no law school student life, which has caused a drop in enrollment, and no effective clinic. I believe the first step in doing what we ought to do, however, is to have a strong, well-rounded faculty, he concluded, and Dunham's appointment would help enormously. Colwell was unmoved, even after Levi enlisted several senior faculty, including Aaron Director, Roscoe Steffen, and Sheldon Teff, to write Colwell directly, urging approval of the appointment. When that failed, Levi went to the top. He wrote Laird Bell, class of 1907, chairman of the Board of Trustees and now interim chancellor, rehearsing his argument for the appointment. When Colwell continued to stall, Levi wrote Bell again, but also apologized if he pushed too much. Within days, the appointment was made. Dunham soon became a national figure in real estate planning and development, and within 5 years of arriving in Chicago, Levi found himself fending off efforts by several schools to appoint or make him dean. Over the next 5 years, Levi continued successful raids on other faculties and appointed 4 young scholars who would prove to be leaders in their different fields. Indeed, so much that in all but one case, their tenure at Chicago was brief. With the faculty strengthened in 1959, Levi was able to realize fully his desire to improve the student body with the establishment of the Floyd Russell Meacham Prize Scholarship, a full tuition award renewable for 3 years and modeled after the proposal Levi had made a decade before. Faculty building and student enrollment were the initial priorities for Edward Levi, but much of his energy during his decade as dean was spent trying to establish institutional structures within and affiliated with the law school to study the operation of law from a social science perspective and to suggest law reform based on carefully analyzed evidence. The legal realists had taken a stab at the objective between the wars, but they were untrained in the social sciences, and many abandoned projects out of frustration or left to work in the New Deal. With Robert Maynard Hutchins conveniently located at the Ford Foundation, Levi sought a large grant from Ford to establish a graduate research and clinical center to bring the knowledge of the social sciences to bear upon the facts of the law and to reformulate such knowledge into acceptable statutory law. After repeated consultation with Ford program officers, the foundation gave the law school a $400,000 grant for 2.5 years. Work began on the study of the jury and delay in court, on the development of commercial arbitration, and on tax reform. Levi thought that the pace of studies was fulfilling his hopes and expectations, so he applied for a 5-year renewal and an increase of the grant to almost $4 million, including $1.5 million for a new building to replace the hopelessly overcrowded Stewart Hall. Foundation's assessment of the projects was mixed, but the grant was renewed in 1955 for 4 years at $1 million, which included $120,000 for faculty salaries and $200,000 for fellowships and comparative legal study, but nothing for a new building. When the Law and Behavioral Science program at the University of Chicago, as the Ford-sponsored enterprise was formerly known, wound up in 1959, it was clear to both faculty and the foundation that there was, in fact, no centrally organized program, as Levi had contemplated. Instead, there were several different activities funded out of the same grant, and notwithstanding repeated reassurances, the program had no long-term effect on the law school. There were a handful of publications, the most significant being Delay in Court and the monumental American Jury, produced by Harry Calvin and Hans Zeisel, but multiple volumes on arbitration and tax reform never appeared. The last goal of Edward Levy's list for making law school one of the premier institutions in the country was to secure a modern building capable of providing needed book space, classroom and study areas, and quarters for the growing faculty and staff. In 1954, he wrote Chancellor Lawrence A. Kimpton outlining the inadequacies of Stewart Hall, pointing out that enrollments had not only stabilized but grown, as had staff, thanks to the Ford grant. Levi asked that a new building be part of the pending $33 million capital campaign. Kimpton rejected the request, and the trustees decided, as one eyewitness later recalled, to eliminate, for campaign purposes, specific divisional or graduate school needs, however urgent, to include only all university needs, such as faculty salaries, endowments, dormitories, etc. Although the deans were advised of the decision, Levi went to Glenn Lloyd, class of 1923 and a senior trustee, and convinced him that the law school required its own campaign due to the urgencies of the condition in Stewart and the risk of jeopardizing the achievements in faculty and student body. Lloyd agreed to support the proposal to the campaign steering committee, and against the strong advice of campaign consultants, the building campaign was launched. On January 18, 1956, Kimpton announced that the Ford Foundation had granted $800,000 for the construction of a new law school building, and Levi then embarked on his capital campaign. The distinguished architect, Eero Saarinen, was retained to design the building in consultation with a 32-man committee chaired by Lloyd. More than 1,400 alumni contributed $2.7 million to complete funding of the project, which broke ground in 1957. The building was open for the autumn term 1959. The impressive thing about Ed, one faculty member later recalled, is that he got the building planned and then he got the alumni to pay for it. In less than a decade, Edward Levi had dramatically improved the quality of faculty, enhanced the numbers and quality of the student body, and delivered a striking modern facility to house the enterprise. If his visions of sustained social science research to reform the law failed in his initial hopes, he was able to bolster the presence of economic analysis in the classroom, teaching antitrust with Aaron Director, and in the literature, supporting the establishment of the Journal of Law and Economics in 1958. At his death, Hannah Gray neatly summarized his achievement as dean. Edward inherited an institution suffering from decline in quality, morale, and visibility. He led the school to renewed intellectual distinction and educational vigor, recruiting first-rate scholars and encouraging interdisciplinary approach to legal studies. He came to be identified especially with a field known as law and economics, but he was interested also in other areas of the social sciences and their relation to law, and helped to stimulate their exploration. His own scholarly work encompassed jurisprudence, constitutional law, bankruptcy, and reorganization as well. It is his most accessibly distilled in his book entitled An Introduction to Legal Reasoning, 1949, which has remained a classic in the field. A perfect summary. Thank you.
So I've been asked to make some comments about what Edward was like as a teacher and as a mentor, which will be somewhat less analytical and somewhat more just reflections through my own experiences. I should, by way of background, then just say a word about how I got to law school, which was important to understand what Edward came to mean to me as to so many other students. I graduated college in the late 1970s at a time when the humanities reigned and the idea of going into a profession was widely discredited among my generation. I had zero desire to go to law school, and in fact, no plans to do so. Graduated college, moved to New York, where I thought I would become some sort of writer or artist, only to have my mother call me almost every night, pressing me to go get a job. I finally decided I would go to law school because that was one of three things that were acceptable to her, the others being medicine, which was I did not have the background for, or becoming an accountant, which seemed even worse than going to law school, and decided I would go but drop out after a few weeks so I could say to her, I tried it, now I'm going back to New York to live with my friends. I came to the University of Chicago because Dick Badger let me in and actually made it affordable. Elements was at the time part of the first quarter introduction to law that all law students had. Now let me say a few words about the class itself before I talk about Edward as a teacher. As Dennis mentioned, the materials for Elements of Law were something that Edward had started working on very, very early in his life, and they were designed to really give someone a picture of what the law was, what its role was, and how it worked all at once. The structure of the class was really divided. You wouldn't know this necessarily just from looking at the materials, but it was really divided into three separate parts. And the first part of the course was to give students an overall picture of the way the law looked. Now, the materials started with the debate between Thrasymachus and Socrates from the Republic. It ended with Roe versus Wade about 2,000 pages later, and it essentially covered literally everything in between those two. And I mean that in a quite literal sense. I'm actually thrilled that I got to read it because there were so many things that I got exposed to that law students today just do not get a chance to read or experience. Everything from Lord Cook's cases, the actual cases, to Blackstone and Austin, and just a variety of materials from philosophy, from psychology, from sociology, and so on. But the structure of the course was quite clear in retrospect. The first part was designed to give you a sense of the structure of the law. So that first section was justice, right? You started with the idea of justice, and then on top of that, you layered on the idea of natural law, something about which Edward had written an article very early in his career, which I was lucky to discover in the library because otherwise I would have had no idea what that section of the course was about. And then the development of fundamental law and the common law and positive law straight up through. So it was, in Edward's mind, a kind of pyramid with each additional layer resting on the base of the one above it. There was then a middle section of the course which was designed to expose you to a set of problems that really tested that structure and how it worked. And they were almost random in seeming because they covered so much variety. So you did the relationship of law to morality. You did the question of sovereignty with these amazing Rhodesian cases from the 1960s when the Rhodesians broke from England and the Supreme Court of Rhodesia had to decide how to deal with a revolution and a new constitution. You did the emergence of process and the jury and just a variety of problems. We did Nuremberg and so on. And then the last section of the course was the introduction to legal reasoning. That was divided into three parts, and he walked you through the process of common law interpretation, of statutory interpretation, and finally constitutional interpretation, as I said, finishing with Roe versus Wade. It was a feast and unbelievably challenging. Now, the thing I have subsequently come to understand about these materials is they really did need Edward as a teacher to bring them to life. I know that partly because I have subsequently tried to teach them. And I did it as an advanced seminar for third-year students, and they are virtually impossible to teach. David and I were going to try and co-teach them at some point, and then he decided to go off and become a dean somewhere. So we never got to do that. Edward as a teacher was really also quite a unique experience, particularly with these materials. It was, a time relatively soon after the paper chase, and I think most of us who came to law school had very much that sensibility in mind too about what our teachers were going to be like. Most of them weren't. The University of Chicago had already changed. There were a lot of young whippersnappers like Jeff, who were already on the faculty, but there were a handful of professors, and in particular Edward, Bernie Meltzer, and Walter Blum, who stood apart in the minds of the students, who seemed impossibly distant. But of them, Edward really stood out in a very special way. That was partly because Walter could be seen walking through the halls, taking down posters that students had stuck on the wall, and was very accessible. And of course, Bernie was a very big personality and character in class, whereas Edward really did have that Kingsfield kind of manner, where he just seemed distant and all-knowing, and conveyed that sense of law professor as priest introducing us students to a religion that we were just beginning to learn. The class was structured in that form then, which is to say it was, as far as we knew, unstructured. There were no syllabi. There were no structured explanations of what you were doing. You were supposed to figure that out for yourself as you went through the class, which of course made it tremendously challenging. The work assigned was enormous. As I said, there were 2,000 pages. Now these were single-spaced typewritten pages, so more than a page that would show up in a printed book. We were, of course, on a quarter system, so we had 10 weeks when we were meeting 3 times a week to get through the 2,000 pages. So there would often be 180 pages of reading a night, of dense materials that consisted of a mix of cases, historical materials. Try reading 50 pages of Lord Cook's opinions in a night without tearing your hair out. I had hair back then. It was just assumed that the students would do this, of course. There was no option to pass, no thought of an option to pass. And in the class, it was in a style of teaching that, again, we don't really do today any longer. So there are still professors who do cold calling. I do it myself, and who think they do Socratic method. But this was truly, what Jeff described was what class was like every day, which was just one question after another. It could be quite terrifying. There were 180 students in the class. This was, of course, before there were sections as well. That meant when you made a fool of yourself, there was nowhere to hide because every single person in your class was there to see you do it. Edward did not suffer fools, so he would ask the questions, and if the answer was not up to his expectations, he would stay with you and push you until you figured it out. There was no coddling. He made fun of us. And yet, at the same time, and unlike teachers who did that, it never really felt bad. It was clear that it was all done in an atmosphere of high expectations from him, or by him, of us, and of enormous seriousness. A student, you never doubted that what was being done to you was you were being pushed and challenged to come to understand something yourself rather than simply having it told to you. Took me a long time to understand this, as much as I do now, that the process of really forcing students to understand the argument themselves as opposed to telling it to them is where all of the learning actually takes place. And so now we talk about doing this as, and at least when I talk to my students, it's giving them I could tell you how to play the guitar and you wouldn't be able to play if I put the guitar in your hand and make you pluck out the horrible version of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and over again, eventually you get better at it. And we did a lot of bad versions of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star in Edward's classes. But the high intellectuality was really something that was both memorable and challenging. And I should say what the entire class was grounded in is something that is increasingly lost today. It's not just the idea of a lawyer as more than a hired hand, which was, of course, embedded in everything that we did throughout the law school. But it was really the strong sense of the law as a learned profession, that to know and understand the law alone or the law in isolation was not to be a real lawyer. That to be a real lawyer was to understand the way in which the law was embedded in all of these other disciplines and ideas and trains of thought and ways of thinking about the world and the role of law in it. Now, this was 1981, and it was an inflection point in many ways. Edward was teaching us, I think, near the end of what had been a style of being a lawyer and of thinking about law. It was reflected in Dennis's comment about how for many people an introduction to legal reasoning has come to feel dated. And he said that and I wanted to resist that. It does not feel dated to me. I still assign it to all of my students, or I don't assign it so much anymore as put it on a list of recommended reading. I still use it all the time myself, and yet there is a kind of truth to that. And as I say, I think that's something that has been lost to the misfortune of legal education and the legal profession, broadly speaking. The point of elements, the point of that course, and the point of what Edward was trying to teach us as we walked in the door to law school was to show how law related to everything. But also, at the same time, as he was showing you the way in which you could not understand law without understanding ideas drawn from so many other disciplines, he was showing you how law had its own independent art, independent architecture, and independent integrity. And how that integrity had its own value and its own worth. And of course, this is just at the moment that law was being attacked from within by critical legal studies on the left and by law and economics on the right, and Edward rejected both of them. And he rejected both of them precisely for their reductionism, for the notion that what was really behind what was going on in the law was this one thing, some version of a story about power. And it was for the same reasons he also rejected the other developing movement at the time, which was originalism in constitutional law, for its reductionism. I should say a word about law and economics. Edward Levi was, of course, one of the founders of the law and economics movement, both personally and in the hires that he made at the University of Chicago Law School. But his law and economics was not designed to deconstruct the law and show that it was driven entirely by economic forces any more than it was driven by political powers, as the adherents of CLS held. It was to try and understand the fields of law that regulated economic matters with a sophisticated understanding of economics to inform the shape of legal rules. That economics was one factor among many in that process of forensic legal analysis, which is what all true lawyers understood and understood how to do. I remember hearing a talk near the end of my time on the faculty at the University of Chicago by Dick Posner, in which he explained to the audience that law wasn't really a discipline because it didn't really have its own methodology. And I think what Edward was trying to teach us was exactly why that was wrong. That there was, is in fact, a genuine methodology to law, but that it's somewhere between an art and a science, and it is as much an aspect of performance to it as anything else. That it's not purely an analytical discipline, but that it is not an unanalytical discipline either. And so it becomes very hard to classify Edward as a scholar. He had, of course, a touch of legal realism about him, although the soft version, a la Carl Llewellyn. He had a touch of legal process in him, like Hart and Sachs, a very large dollop of law and society, which was, in fact, in some sense, the dominant trend in his thinking, which was to understand the way in which law was shaped by society and shaped society. But all of that was really wrapped into a sophisticated process of legal reasoning, which is why the Introduction to Legal Reasoning is such an important book. A bigger inflection point than the change in the way people were thinking about law that was taking place in the early and mid-1980s was also a change in law students. The age, and I hate to say this, because I was part of this generation, but the age of idealistic lawyering was ending. It wasn't quite over yet, but it was ending. The 60s and 70s, which had given such a large push to the role of law school and lawyers in public consciousness, was just fading, beginning to be replaced by, I hate to say it, I think, but by the MBA. And as that was dying, so too was the age of, or understanding of law, again in the public consciousness at least, as a kind of regal profession. Now all of this is worse today, but it was the beginning of the period when law was becoming a business, right? We were just beginning to experience that shift in the legal profession. When the role of the lawyer, when the nature of law firms, when the kind of legal culture into which our students graduate was changing very much. And so there were students who absolutely loved elements and who found Edward's class exciting and challenging and affirming of the reasons that they had come to law school. But there were others who just didn't get it, who didn't see the point, and who found the class much more difficult than it was worth because they didn't understand why they were supposed to learn any of these things, since what they had in mind was a particular kind of trade or job. Now, that was not the reason Edward stopped teaching. I took the class from him in 1981. He taught it for the last time my third year. Actually met my first wife in his class. I was his research assistant, and I would sit in on the class, and I ended up sitting next to her. So I don't think, and that was the last time he taught it. His worsening Alzheimer's was, I think, the reason he stopped teaching. But I have always believed that this change in law students that was taking place was a part of it. The year before my class took it, there had been a virtual rebellion from the students who really just did not understand the amount of work that was being demanded of them. And although they went through it, when I came to law school, we heard all sorts of horrible things, which turned out not to be the case at all. As I say, I think my class, people liked it a lot, but there was this change taking place in the student culture, and Edward did remark on it from time to time in the work that I was doing for him as a research assistant. He was just, I think, enjoying his teaching less and less, as students seemed less and less receptive to what it was that he was offering them. Now, I was not one of those students. I loved elements. As I said, it's why I stayed in law school. It was the thing that opened up to my eyes and mind what was so wonderful about this profession, and lessons that I have never for a minute lost, even now that I've largely moved out of the legal profession. It led me to ask Edward if I could work for him. So the class finished, and after the last class, I went up to his office and I knocked on the door. And I should say, up to that point in time, this was the only time I'd ever done that. I had never actually approached a professor outside of class on my own. I think I thought I was too cool for that. But I was completely taken with this class, and so I knocked on the door, and I gave him some excited, relatively incoherent babbling about how much I had enjoyed the class because, you know, it had given me a sense of what it was like to get outside of the forest and be able to see the whole thing and not be lost for the trees, and how amazing it must be to be him and to be able to do that, and I wanted to be him and be able to do that, and could I please work for him? And I remember his reaction, which is he stared at me for, 20 minutes. I mean, it was probably only 15 or 20 seconds, but it absolutely felt like 20 minutes. With, as everybody who knew him would remember, this slightly bemused look on his face. And I'm sure, just sort of overwhelmed by my naivete. He then explained to me that he really had no need for a research assistant because he already had someone, but that, if I really wanted to and I came by, he would try and fit me in and give me some of the work. And as it turned out, there was quite a bit of it. And so over time, there came to be more and more. And I worked for him for all of the 3 years I was in law school. Working for Edward was actually not so dissimilar from taking a class with him. Our work was on the elements materials. They needed to be cut down. There had been one edition published in the 1950s that I once saw in the library at Chicago, but they had grown considerably since then. As I said, they were nearly 2,000 pages, and nobody was willing to publish anything that long. So he had been told by West and also by, I guess it was Little Brown back then, now Aspen, that if he could cut them in half, they would publish them. Well, of course, he couldn't really do that. He was trying gamely to do so, but the line about editing yourself is like killing your children was very much true, I think, in this case. But nonetheless, he was gamely going through the process of trying to cut down the materials. And there was a lot of cutting taking place. It was just that for every cut, he was finding new things that he thought he needed to add, and so the materials stayed roughly the same size. Edward did all the work. He did it himself. He found the things that he wanted to add or the things that he wanted to cut. And our task was largely to check his edits for accuracy, but also to talk to him about the materials. And he would give us a section, and we would work them through, and we would check everything, and then he would sit with us. There were 2 of us my first year, and then it was me alone, just to talk through the materials. And I think, as I say, it was very much like class, and only slightly less terrifying in that there was not 178 other people to see you make a fool of yourself, but to really capture the ways in which we were not understanding what he was trying to get students to see through the materials. It was an incredible learning experience for me. Just incredible. And you could go over those materials every year for the rest of your life and still not get everything that there was to be gotten out of them. although somehow I think he had all of it. I was never sure what he thought about me and about the work I was doing. He never complimented us, ever. If we did make a mistake, he let us know. Not meanly, but he let us know. And after a relatively short time, I came to understand actually that if he didn't comment on my having made a mistake, that was actually a pretty high compliment. And you just knew that, and it made the work also incredibly gratifying. It's actually a practice I, not self-consciously, but discover I have adopted myself, and hope that the people that work for me understand as well. I would love to remember to issue the compliments. It just doesn't seem to occur. Edward did, however, follow through as a recommender, and which was really what I was uncertain. I worked 10 to 15 hours a week for him for the 3 years. And as I say, at the time, I was never completely sure what he actually thought of me, other than that he kept me on. But I got a clerkship, and the next year clerked for Judge Friendly. And I had one all-nighter. And while I was there in the middle of the night, and no one else was there, I confess I looked in the files. And there was my hiring file with my letters of recommendation. So I actually saw the letter that he wrote. And what was interesting about it was, it was, I suppose, what I would have expected. He said that I was not the most brilliant student he had ever seen, but that I was certainly adequately intellectual for the job. But that, actually, I took that as extremely high praise, to be honest. And that the reason he recommended me, though, was my enthusiasm for the law and for what we could do with it. There were other things in it, and it struck me at the time as what was pleasing was actually he had perceived much more than I would have expected about how I worked and how I thought about things. And I think that was a very big part of Edward, which was he was extremely perceptive about people. And you see that in his writings as well, and in the speeches that he gave as Attorney General. One of the things that comes through in them is beyond the intellectualism, is a real understanding of how people work, how they think, and what makes them tick. I feel as though I owe my career to Edward, both for having shown me why I should stay in law school, but also for how strongly influential he was in how I think about law and still do today. And I'm not alone in that. I've spoken to a great many of his former students and found that so many of them had the same experience and reaction I did. During the year I was interviewing for clerkships, I interviewed with Robert Bork, who described exactly the same experience I had, and who told me one of my favorite stories, because it just captured, for me, what I was experiencing at the time, which was he and Eb Mikva were classmates. They took the antitrust class together. They got very excited in the way that Edward could do, because he opened up so many ideas to you. But they were in disagreement, and it was after a class. This must have been in the old, no, I guess it would have been in the new building of the law school. And they were each on either side of him and arguing, and he didn't say a word, and he walked with them and let them argue, and then they got all the way to the point where you went through a door, and he just walked through the door and let it close behind them and never said a word. And that was because he led by example. That was really what I learned from Edward, was not from him telling me what I should think or how I should think, but just from him showing me how to think. At the time of his death, there were probably around 9,000 living alumni of the University of Chicago, most of whom had Edward as a teacher. Not all, because there were a couple of years when he was away, of course, but most of whom would have had him as a teacher. And I've often thought that among the many achievements and legacies that he had, probably the most important one, and certainly the most long-lasting one in many ways, was the shaping of these 9,000 or so people who became lawyers in a particular way because of that exposure, who carried that on, and who, many of whom, I think, like me, have tried to pass that along to our own students. Thank you.
I've been asked to speak on Edward Levi as university leader. I'm going to be talking about the period between 1962, when he became provost, and 1975, when he left the presidency. I'm going to talk first a little bit about how he became a provost, and which is a rather interesting but somewhat strange story. and some of the key issues that he dealt with as provost, for, in particular, some brief reflections on his presidency and then some final reflections on his career as a leader. In March 1960, Lawrence Kimpton resigned from the university as chancellor. Kimpton had devoted a great deal of effort during the 1950s trying to respond to enormous problems that the university was facing, the collapse of the neighborhood, distress in the neighborhood, massive losses in senior faculty, collapse in college enrollments, an acute and ongoing budget crisis. Kimpton had undertaken near heroic service, but he was exhausted and wanted out, even though his close friend, George Watkins, who had been his vice president for development, warned him that if he left office, he would go down in history as, quote, the guy who saved the neighborhood, and that's about it, which unfortunately is more or less proven to be the case. Nonetheless, Kimpton resigned. It was actually quite a distinguished and indeed a great presidency, but that's a story for another time and place. The search for Kimpton's successor commenced in the spring of 1960, and it proved more difficult than expected. The two top candidates, McGeorge Bundy of Harvard and Clark Kerr of Berkeley, both toyed with the idea of the Chicago presidency, but eventually rejected it. The then chairman of our board of trustees, Glenn Lloyd, who has been mentioned before, Lloyd was by now the chair of the board, personally contacted Bundy, who is the dean of the Faculty of the Arts and Sciences at Harvard, to ascertain his candidacy. Lloyd seems to have been taken with Bundy, and when Bundy said no, he asked David Rockefeller to intervene to persuade Bundy to change his mind. Bundy did not do so, but instead wrote a detailed and rather insightful 5-page critique of Chicago's situation that is still worth reading today. Bundy argued, and this is September of 1960, that the University of Chicago was once great but had slipped academically in the last 10 years. And although Bundy found much that was attractive about Chicago's traditions, he feared that no permanent recovery from this morass of the 1950s could take place without a massive recapitalization of the university, and that, quote, unless there is a really radical reinforcement of the unrestricted financial resources of the university above and beyond the efforts that an ordinary president and conscientious board of trustees are always making for the institutions, I see no prospect that this university can, as a whole, play in the next generation the extraordinarily important, innovating role it has played in the past, unquote. And then Bundy offered his prescription. The university needed an immediate cash infusion of $200 million. And this would be the beginning, but not the end, of a process of rebuilding. And with luck, if the university was very lucky and wise, it would then not need a second infusion down the line, so that this recapitalization would somehow take on a life of its own. I think Lloyd was taken with this missive. But Bundy said no, and it was simply an extraordinary letter put in the files. With Bundy and Kerr out of the running, the committee came up with a less than compelling short list, at the top of which was George Beadle, who was a professor of biology at California Institute of Technology, who had won the Nobel Prize in Genetics in 1958, and had served as a chair of the Division of Biology at Caltech since 1946. The committee needed to conclude the deliberations, and they chose Beadle. During the course of the presidential search, the issue of the structure of the central governance at the university had emerged. Glenn Lloyd and a number of other trustees were concerned that one of the reasons that Kimpton had become so exhausted and that a kind of alienation had crept in between Kimpton and the faculty was that Kimpton was doing too much, that he needed either a second in command or some kind of dual presidency or other dualistic power arrangement. And there were actually a number of drafts that were floating around in which the board thought of restructuring. They brought in a consultant from McKinsey who proposed one possible organizational setup. Beadle was appointed in early 1961 without any definite resolution of this issue, although the idea of some kind of dual governance team was in the minds of the trustees. And this is relevant because when Beadle takes office in May of 1961, there were problems. Beadle was a very charming person. He was an engaging personality, a friendly man, but he proved to be a somewhat indecisive person. He had little relevant senior administrative experience to fall back upon in taking charge of what is then and certainly now a very complex campus culture with very distinctive local tribal traditions. Given that Pat Harrison, who had served as Kimpton's vice president, had been taken ill, he had a heart attack, Beadle co-opted Lowell Coggeshall, who was the dean of the Biological Sciences Division. Coggeshall was a very methodical person, and the two actually began to get on, and they liked each other. Beadle also recruited a very young John Wilson from the National Science Foundation on the assurance that eventually he would make him a vice president. And the three, Coggeshall, Wilson, and Beadle, began to try to create a presidency. The Coggeshall kept very detailed private minutes, or minutes in his private papers of the meetings. They read like a kind of a committee of public safety during the French Revolution. A number of people sitting around the table, well, who's going to deal with this crisis? Okay, you do this, and you do that, and so forth and so on, which is fine, except that one does sense a kind of sense of drift, and this began to bother the board. The board, who had raised not $200 million, but $3.5 million in what was called the Presidential Suspense Fund, which was a lot of money in 1961, to kind of jumpstart the presidency to begin the rebuilding of the academic side of the university. And a number of trustees began to sense that Beadle was not able to develop a coherent plan for not only for spending this particular amount of money, but actually for developing a plan to begin a major capital campaign to rebuild the university. Beadle took Lloyd out to lunch in August of 1961 and said, I think I've solved the problem. I want Lowell Coggeshall to be my number two. Glenn Lloyd clearly thought very little of that idea. And over the course of the late 1961, early 1962, attention begins to shift Edward Levy. I actually had the pleasure of discussing with Edward Levy how he became president as a very young dean in the summer of '93. I had written something about Edward Levy that was complimentary. I don't remember what it was, but I'm sure it was deservedly complimentary. And he called me up and said he wanted to have lunch with me. And we talked about the college for a while, and then being an historian, I said to myself, I ought to ask this famous person some historical questions. So I asked him, how did you become provost? And so he told me a story which is, I think, more or less comports with the record. Levy's name had actually popped up during the search for the successor to Beadle, and we know that he had supported Beadle. In Muriel Beadle's memoir, Where Did All the Ivy Gone? She reports that actually Levy had made a critical phone call to Beadle that, according to her, persuaded Beadle to accept the job. Beadle, as Dennis Hutchinson has pointed out, was a close friend and was very much admired by Glenn Lloyd. So at some point during March of 1961, Lloyd contacted Levy. And this was the story that Levy communicated to me. Told him that the board was concerned about the drift in academic planning and lack of leadership that Beadle was and his team were demonstrating, and that the trustees had decided there should be a new number two position, and that he, Edward Levy, should take it. Levy, according to this account, demurred and said that he didn't want this job, at which, again, this is Levy's story from 1993. Glenn Lloyd leaned over the table to him and said, Ed, you remember the search committee, you persuaded George to take the job, you helped get us into this mess, and now you're going to help get us out of it. Levy's recollections are actually confirmed by the written records of correspondence between Edward Ryerson, who was the former chairman of the board, and Glenn Lloyd. Ryerson was charged with taking Beadle out to lunch in early 1962 and conveying to him in a what Lloyd called a very frank and satisfactory discussion the unhappiness of the board and the changes they wanted. Ryerson reports back to Lloyd that Beadle, quote, may lack the decisiveness to get it done and may need a good deal of prodding and pressure. Lloyd actually provided the pressure in a series of meetings with Beadle, and then with Beadle with Coggeshall. They worked out an arrangement. Coggeshall was given a kind of consolation prize by being appointed to them as a member of the board, and Beadle agrees to take Levy. It's important, I think the events are important because Levy, in a sense, was able to write his own job description. He did not want to become a vice president. He didn't want to become a senior vice president. And it's very clear that if you look at the various drafts that were floating around, that the the job of provost was actually written by Levi because he wanted a different kind of executive authority that would prove, and I think has proven, to be of immense importance for the future of the university. The trustees were delighted. Fairfax Cohn writes to Levi that I'm one of a large number of people who think that your appointment of provost is the best thing that has happened to the University of Chicago in a long while. And Edward Levy's joining of the administration was immediately, you can see it in the minutes of the board and a lot of other things, that all of a sudden you begin to have cohesion and planful direction. So I want to talk, secondly, a little bit about his strategy for renewing the university. I want to focus on 4 issues. I think Levy's first strategy for the university was very much the strategy that Dennis Hutchinson has articulated for the law school, the rebuilding of the faculty. Over the course of the 1950s, the university had lost a series of eminent scholars to other departments, and what Levi does is come up with a plan for recruiting top talent. The university professorships were this was his project. He persuades the board to create 5 and then an additional 5 new distinguished service professorships for local luminaries who the university professorships were for people to be recruited from the outside. The DSPs were for senior people from the inside. And the record of what happens between 1962 and 1967 is an extraordinary rebuilding of the faculty. If you go department by department, division by division, over 100 new full professors, over 60 new tenured associate professors, and these were oftentimes people were of very key importance. In my own department, the 2 outstanding appointments, Leonard Krieger and John Hope Franklin, men of extraordinary distinction, but who also helped to kind of reshape the profile of the department. And so there is, in a sense, an extraordinary rebuilding of the faculty. And Levi took great pride in this. He later writes that I think we are one of the few universities in the country that could have gone down as much as we did. He's talking about the 50s, and come back as strong as we did. And I'm quite willing to say that this shows some kind of inner strength and values. So the rebuilding of the faculty was the first agenda, but this leads me to the second and a much broader strategy of what comes to be called the Ford profile or the Ford plan. The trustees did not, they wanted the faculty rebuilt, but they wanted the university rebuilt. And one doesn't rebuild a university without reimagining a university. And lacking a $200 million, a handy $200 million gift, such as McGeorge Bundy had suggested we needed, there had to be an alternative strategy. And it was a strategy which began with an approach to the Ford Foundation. Again, the pattern of reliance on the Ford is interesting, following the career in the law school. But during the 60s, the Ford Foundation was making a reasonably large number of grants under what was called the Special Program and Education Initiative, large grants to recapitalize universities. And so to make a very complicated and quite fascinating story short, Levi assumes the provostship, sets in motion a very skillful, comprehensive planning process across the university to develop an application to the Ford Foundation, which he almost, in the end, single-handedly wrote. It's quite an ambitious 2-volume document called the Ford Profile, in which the university is reimagined, the faculty is expanded decisively from 600 faculty in 1960. We were going to go to almost 1,300 faculty in 1975. Faculty compensation would rise significantly. Levi was always very concerned about the level of faculty compensation. He wanted to always be very close to Harvard, and on no occasion less than 3rd in the country because of the fragility of the situation. And but not only faculty compensation and faculty numbers, there is a very skillful imagining of the facilities and new buildings and major investments projected in student life, massive investments in new residence halls and athletic centers and art facilities and so forth. And all of this is a massive recapitalization of the university, would be paid for initially by the Ford Foundation, but then by a doubling of the tuition income available to the income, which was result from increasing the college from, at that point, 2,000 students to 4,000 students by 1975, rising graduate enrollments, more tuition income from professional students, and then an expected secondary effect, but very powerful effect of rising levels of giving from alumni, who would then be increasing because we would have more students. The gamble of the Ford plan presumed a series of planned deficits, after which the university would return to stable and balanced budgets through an extraordinary success of new tuition revenue, new fundraising, and hopefully more gifts from foundations. This was a plan that the Ford Foundation was initially very skeptical of doing this, and it took a lot of negotiations. Levy had good connections there in the foundation. I think the personal connections were important. But I think the logic and the eloquence and the cogency of the plan itself, it really reminds me very much of Ernest Burton's plan in 1925 that the University of Chicago in 1940. It's one of these rare opportunities for a single individual, a thoughtful individual, skillful politically, but also brilliant conceptually, is able to kind of reimagine the university. And the Ford Foundation bought it. The discussion among the members of the Ford plan, of the Ford board, it's recorded as the following: the University of Chicago, through quiet but heroic efforts over the past decade, has extricated itself from a state of disarray, which could have spelled ruin for a lesser institution with less capable leadership. The Ford Foundation's ability to make a very large grant to the university at the present time represents a rare opportunity to contribute decisively to the renaissance of what once was, and may well be again, this is 1965, may well be again one of the world's great universities. We got the grant in October, and I think it's very important to remember that in some ways, the iconic symbol in terms of buildings of this era, the Regenstein Library, is very much connected to the logic of Levy's Ford plan. If you look at the briefing documents that were prepared for Levy and for George Beadle when they met with the family to try to negotiate this gift, which came very late, they had tried a number of other sources. It's almost as if it's the same presentation basically that Levy made to the Ford board under a different, slightly different guise. And so that the logic of the plan becomes the larger ambient, provides a larger ambient culture in which major donors like the Regenstein family, it seems to me, could have confidence that they weren't simply building a building qua building, but this was a key point to begin to rebuild faculty research, graduate student research opportunities. It originally was described as a graduate research library. And then the reception of the Regenstein gift leads to other gifts, the Searle gift, Weiler, and others. So you have an impressive array of other buildings that come in the aftermath. Okay, the third point in which Edward Levy took great interest was the college. The college had been in a rather difficult and some would argue desperate situation in the 1950s. Kimpton had done a great deal to try to revive enrollments and to rebalance the curriculum, but we were still in a rather bleak state. Of the class that matriculated in the autumn of 1958, about 25% dropped out by the end of the first year, and then by the end of the second year, another 15%. So you have classes losing almost 50% of their students. This was a situation in which Levy inherited as provost, and it's important to remember that he had basically committed to the Ford Foundation that we would rebuild the college demographically as part of this larger logic of rebuilding the university financially and academically. Levy intervened in a long programmatic memo. The dean of the college at the time, Alan Simpson, had resigned to become president of Vassar College, and writes a memo to the faculty proposing a reorganization of the college. It's a complicated memo, and I don't need to go into details here. It creates the collegiate divisions, which are important. And what he was trying to do was two things. First of all, to create the conditions of possibility by which the divisional faculty who were more associated with graduate teaching could become integral members of the college faculty, and end this civil war that had been going on between the divisions in the college throughout the 50s. And secondly, to create then with this new college, a college that because the faculty would be drawn from all over the university, not just the divisions, but I think also from the professional schools. And Levy himself eventually, I believe, comes to teach college students later in his career. least advises them, that the footprint of the college would become broader and it would be a unifying influence. And here you get these Harperian ideas that Tom Rosenbaum referred to in his introduction of the whole university or one university. This is a rhetoric that Levi takes from Harper. And it's easy to say you should have one university. How are you going to do it? Well, one way of doing it is to create these trans unit programs, and Levi wanted the college to serve as not so much as a central hub of the university, but as a source of unity programmatically. And he does this. The structure does not solve the curricular problems, and it doesn't solve the student life problems that were plaguing the college, and I'll come back to that in a moment. And then the final topic in which, I think subject area in which Levi took great interest was a discursive strategy, and these are his speeches. Now, this was a domain which was, I think, quite important to him. Between 64 and the early 70s, he gives a number of speeches that are eventually published in a book called Points of View, Talks on Education. I think whether he intended to do this when he began these speeches, they do become a program, a public rhetoric to reimagine and rearticulate the mission and ideals of the university. To reanimate the identity of the university to its own constituencies, to the faculty and to the alumni, to reassure, to kind of tell the story once again of who we are and who we want to be, what we want to become, to explain, secondly, how close to disaster we had come, and then thirdly, and one sees this evolution from the mid-60s to the early 70s, to begin to explain the broader purposes of all universities to the public at large at a time when, in the later 60s, universities seemed to be caught in a vice between a kind of popular anti-intellectualism on the one hand and strident demands for social and political relevance for another, on the other. Inevitably, in reading these speeches, one is tempted to compare them with the great speeches of Robert Hutchins of the 1930s. And the comparison is not irrelevant because there were deep personal and professional ties that connected Levi with Hutchins from the mid-30s to the end of Levi's career. Levi admired Hutchins' educational philosophy. He once confessed to an interviewer, George Dell, that I had a father-son relationship with Hutchins, and almost all that I am is now due to him. And it's very interesting that when Levi is appointed provost, the veterans of the battle-scarred veterans of the Hutchins era, people who had left under Kimpton, people like Adler and Champ Ward, write to Levi, congratulating him, and the tone of the congratulatory letters is, well, now the Hutchins heritage is going to come back again. There'll be a kind of counter-revolution. But there are limits to the comparison. One sees these limits openly, and if you look at Levy's speech on the university and the community, which he gave to an alumni gathering in Washington, D.C. in June 1958, which I think is one of his very best speeches. And the argument is that the universities, plural, have to be involved in the communities, but they must not confuse themselves with becoming what Levi called handy agencies to solve immediate problems. The speech was a quite eloquent defense and I think a rather brave and courageous defense of what a university should be and what it must not become or be tempted to become. The faculty, the copies were sent all over the university. Most of the faculty applauded it. One faculty member writes, "I'm really proud that we have a president who can write a speech like that." The one cautionary note comes from Bill McNeil, a distinguished historian, also a product of Chicago, and who knew Levi, I think, well enough to know his ties with Hutchins. And McNeil writes a rather a letter which I think must have disturbed Levi a little bit, saying, this was too complicated. It wasn't naive. It wasn't Hutchins enough. And when you take office, this is in June '68, when you take office in November, I hope you'll find your own voice, by which McNeil means I hope you'll find Hutchins' voice, redivivus. I think the problem with this comparison is it misunderstands the situation that Hutchins faced in the 30s and the situation that Levi faced in the 60s. I think the 60s were a much more difficult time. Edward Levi found himself facing an almost Corsair-like revolutionary morass in which words and received understandings about higher education and the basic purposes of the universities no longer seemed to hold sway or give comfort. And so that the complexity of the speech, which Hutchins would not have done, it seems to me both appropriate and wise. Ironically, if Hutchins was Levy's spiritus rector, the historical figure whom he most often invoked was William Rainey Harper. As I've mentioned, he relied on Harper for his mainstay argument, what John Wilson later called Mr. Levy's catechism about the university as one or whole. Now, we could argue, we might not want to, but we could, about what it means to be a whole or unified university, and whether Harper meant the same thing as Levy did, or vice versa. It was a structural argument, but also a moral one. It was an attempt to insist that the unity of the community was what enabled us to hold together in the dark days of the 40s and 50s, and it was this unified community that would now reemerge to the brightness and reform and renewal of the 1960s. It was a very powerful argument, and it was an attempt to historicize the university's special notability by using a kind of standard of judgment that most people not only understood, but they affirmed. And, but it's also a way of challenging contemporaries to take seriously the need for the university to survive on its own terms. George Beadle announces in June of 1967 that he's retiring. The board sets in motion procedures to find a successor. The process went very quickly this time. I think this was the fastest presidential search the university has ever mounted, with the exception perhaps of Harper's appointment. Edward Levy takes office in mid-November 1968. The early months of his presidency were consumed by managing the great student sit-in of early 1969. The story of the sit-in is a complex one. I'm not going to go into it here, but I think it's fair to say that it hit Levy hard on a personal and professional level. He was caught in the middle of terrible and dreadful upheavals, and I think his most powerful impulse must have been somehow to try to find ways to hold the university together. The tumult of the sit-in passed, but more fundamental challenges emerged. Unlike most of our previous presidents before they took office, Levy actually knew the real financial condition of the university when he was inaugurated in 1968. And it was only guardedly promising. And you can see this in internal staff memos. That I think even by 1967, Levy realized that the campaign that had been launched around the Ford grant, which was an enormous, a grant of $25 million cash in 1965 is, I'm told, is something between $150 and $200 million today. This was an enormous amount of money. And the golden days are here, the great promises, and yet the campaign fell short. By 1970, we had accumulated less than half of the funds we needed for buildings. We were basically living off the proceeds of the Ford grant, and you then have the budget crisis that affected all universities in the early 70s, the university facing a looming fiscal crisis. And the problem was not simply that we had faced, because all universities were facing these crises, the problems in the market, but we had made a series of commitments, indeed promises, to the Ford Foundation and to other foundations about rebuilding our enrollments, rebuilding our plant, rebuilding our student culture, which unfortunately were not able to be undertaken. And Warner Wick, who was the dean of students in 1966, as early as 66, is quoted in the Maroon as saying, the difficulty with money for housing, student housing was in terrible shape, is that it usually comes from unrestricted grants, the same money that is in the backbone of our academic programs. Thus, housing is in direct competition with our most serious academic needs. And so that this problem of student life, the problem of student enrollments plagued the university, and on top of everything else, the patterns of foundation giving also change. We learned this in an ironic but sense of kind of the other shoe dropping. As we struggled with the frustrations of budgetary austerity in the early 70s, there was always hope of one more outside intervention. And in the summer of 1973, Edward Levy journeys back to New York with some trustees to ask for another major grant from the Ford Foundation. And this time the answer was a very different one. Instead of yes, it was no. But it was not only no, it was a no that it was accompanied with a very detailed, gratuitous advice about how we should do more to control expenditure, better planning, and what's all this about student enrollments that you promised us in the 1960s. And we were forced to launch the second phase of the campaign for Chicago in the summer of 1974, lacking a major challenge grant, and this campaign immediately ran into trouble and had to be scaled back. Now, the problems that Edward Levy faced were, I think he faced courageously and also with great candor. What's quite remarkable about the 70s is the public voice which Levy encouraged the provost, the deans, and himself to adopt in trying to explain to the faculty the reality of these problems. there were a great deal, it seems to me, admirable self-reflection, which is, I think, true to the man. To the very end of his presidency, he enjoyed the respect, the admiration, and trust of the board and the senior faculty. And when he, in the course of trying to figure out who should succeed him, Gaylord Donnelly writes to Glenn Lloyd in a very typical comment that throughout the country, Levy is recognized now as the best president of the university, so he has brought great honor to the university and us as trustees. So let me conclude by a couple of reflections. In what way was the university better off after Edward Levy's service as leader? On the positive side, there was a reassertion of faculty control of institutional planning, serious and crucial investments in key intellectual and scientific resources. Regenstein Library is a kind of an iconic symbol of the rebuilding, not only of the plant, but also the rebuilding of a faculty culture and a faculty optimism. And a stunning increase in the size of the faculty, rebuilding of key departmental leadership structures, the university professorships, the huge grant of $25 million from the Ford Foundation, which we would never have gotten without Edward Levy's leadership. And I think when Franklin Ford, who had succeeded McGeorge Bundy as dean of the faculty at Harvard, proclaims in 1967 that Chicago is a giant world university, Levy might feel justifiable satisfaction. And indeed, Levy's dignified defense of the university's values chronicled and paralleled a stunning intellectual and cultural recovery in the 60s that I think we should acknowledge built upon the material recovery that Lawrence Kimpton had achieved in the 50s. And in a way, the period 1951 to 1975 is a whole thing. And if one asks my question slightly differently, was the university better off in 1975 than in 1971? I think the answer is certainly equally positive. And in a private note that Levy drafts after Lawrence Kimpton's tragic death in 1977, he writes that Kimpton was a chancellor of the university at a time of crisis. Drastic action is required. He didn't give lip service to the extraordinary leadership. He made them possible by his willingness to face issues that had to be met. He was a person of great talent and insight, innate modesty and courage who loved the university. When I read these lines in Levy's private papers, I remember thinking, well, this could apply to Levy himself. And the final line that he writes, these were just kind of notes that he wrote to himself. He writes that of Kimpton, his role was not the one he would have selected, but it was the one that was required. And certainly, I think, in the times of austerity in the mid-1970s, he must perhaps have felt that as well. On the debit side of these years was the continuing problem of the college and the failure to meet the enrollment targets for either graduate or undergraduate students that we had established for ourselves, and a continuing frustration with student life and frustrations with student life that haunted the university, Levy, and the other senior administrators and the faculty at large in the 60s and throughout the 1970s. I think the real progress with real traction on the college issue only begins in the administration of President Hannah Gray, when college enrollments are increased from 2,500 to 3,400, and when more systematic and sustained investments are able to be brought to student life. This progress continued with investments accelerating with various bumps and controversies, the so-called core wars of the late 1990s, et cetera, and subsequent administrations, with the result being that we now have a college of 5,400 students, about the same size as Yale, which gives the university a structural capacity to be able to fund the wider economy of the arts and sciences in good times and bad. And these demographic changes, which begin in the 1980s, again in the early 80s, have also substantially increased our size of our alumni population, and given the enthusiasm and loyalty of our students and our alumni toward the university that they're demonstrating right now. I think these are positive developments. And of course, one cannot say, as an historian, I can't say that Edward Levi would have approved of these changes, but I believe he probably would have. Looking back on these years, one cannot be struck by how hard it must have been to juggle all these competing concerns and crises, and to do so with the eloquence, the perspective, and the patience that Edward Levi brought to bear. It is telling to compare the letter that McGeorge Bundy wrote to David Rockefeller in September 1960, the one where he says, I don't want the job, but I'm going to tell you what you should do, with a letter that Edward Levi sent to the Ford Foundation in January of 1974, responding to the criticisms the Ford Foundation had made about the university's financial state. The latter document was, of course, especially ironic in that its ultimate addressee was none other than McGeorge Bundy, who was now the president of the Ford Foundation. After 12 years of dedicated, exhausting, and determined leadership, Edward Levi found himself writing a 16-page, single-space letter. This was not drafted by some subordinate. Levi wrote it himself. a 16-page single-space letter defending his record to the officials of the Ford Foundation, a letter that conveys both his evident frustration and, I would have to say, probably a considerable degree of anger as well. In place of the optimism and elan of the original Ford application of 1965, Levi is now forced to recount and explain the series of budget deficits that the university had again been forced to endure, as well as the failure of the university to meet its ambitious student enrollment targets. But he concluded with a sobering thought that, quote, I think there's an assumption, he writes this in 74, I think there's an assumption that the University of Chicago is a wealthy institution that does not need help to retain its quality. I think our problem is serious, that our effort to retain quality has been important and reasonable. It has had to be tried. But that we must be in a position for a sharp further curtailment if that is necessary. The curtailment is likely to require the further elimination of whole areas of the university. This is January of 1974. In fact, the University of Chicago struggled to maintain its distinctiveness in the face of dangerous and in some cases self-inflicted liabilities and against the fiercely competitive winds of change. And there's a kind of perennial quality to this narrative in the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s that made it both remarkable and somewhat daunting. George Bundy had argued in 1960 that the intellectual distinction of a special kind was a much coveted treasure, but that the university needed deeply reliable financial enabling structures to survive and to continually renew itself, and that the ultimate success of the university would be dependent upon both capacities. I think more than anyone else at the University of Chicago, Edward Levi knew this, and his leadership between 1962 and 1975 was an essential intervention to restore and to protect the luster of the former, our extraordinary identity as a world university, while also trying to build up the capacity of the latter. Levi succeeded brilliantly with the first, and he made significant progress in the second, but he also confronted harsh and sometimes bitter financial realities that must have seemed to him undeservedly frustrating. Yet presidential and provostial administrations are never final things. They begin with great optimism and enormous ambition and eventually settle into the sober, hardboard realities of governance. Ambitions meet and bump up against constrained resources, and wise choices must be made, hopefully for the greater good of the central purposes of the university. As much as we might want to affirm Edward Levy's rhetoric or Harper's rhetoric about the university's faculty being marked by a culture of oneness or wholeness, in fact, we've always relied on a small group of leaders to make these choices, leaders who have the vision, the fortitude, and the luck to be able to sustain the academic luster of the institution, but who have also had the skills to guarantee its fundamental possibilities and its longer-term security. Or as Levi put it in response to yet another proposal for spending money that the university did not have in the late 1960s, quote, we have to balance the central strength of the university against all other kinds of good and important works, which in the long run are only possible for us if we have that central strength. This university has always needed strong executive leaders, and without them, the later Judson years, the Mason years, the early Beadle years, it has found itself adrift. These leaders have been called upon to explain why we deserve the support we hope to receive and to find the resources to make it possible for we, the faculty, and I would add the students, to afford our ideals. We were deeply fortunate to have had a scholar and an administrative leader of Edward Levy's insight, courage, and intellectual good taste in what were, in retrospect, quite perilous times in the 1960s and 1970s. Edward Levi may have admired Robert Hutchins for conjuring up images of a youthful and exciting and endlessly unrestful university, images that I think Levi personally found quite congenial, and for deploying those narratives in the 1930s about the university's identity to elicit wide public notoriety. But Edward Levi was also a sensible and a cautious leader, a wise leader who, in contrast to the occasionally reckless behavior of Robert Hutchins, knew the dangers of getting too far ahead of the faculty, even in times when he felt that the faculty were blisteringly wrong. The many committees that Edward Levi appointed, the many reports that he wrote, the many speeches that he gave, the many lunches and dinners with countless and sometimes disgruntled or apprehensive or fearful students and faculty members that Levi endured were manifest attempts to guide and to teach the faculty and the students, nudging them the right way, even if in some cases they refused to go where he wished. I believe that Edward Levi left the University of Chicago in 1975 a far stronger, more vibrant place than he found it in 1962, and I think it is proper and fitting that our history will judge him as having been one of the university's most distinguished academic leaders. Thank you.
The university lost Edward Levi as its president abruptly in 1975. He didn't want to go. This was clear to those of us who worked closely with him in the Department of Justice. As he went through the process of researching and recommending to President Ford a Supreme Court nominee, quite a number of people, including the lawyers in his office, urged him to allow himself to be considered. He wouldn't hear of it. I wouldn't have left the University of Chicago to join the Supreme Court, he said. He only left the university because President Ford appealed to him to help end the crisis of legitimacy in the federal government. And as he said to Ford in his remarks at his swearing-in ceremony, speaking literally, "You moved me." He had worked in the Justice Department before, as we heard, serving as a special assistant to Attorney General Francis Biddle, first assistant in the War Division, first assistant in the Antitrust Division under Thurman Arnold. He knew something of what he was getting into, but not everything. I vividly recall, he said in a speech not long before he left office, that quite late in the afternoon on my first day as Attorney General, just as I was settling into my chair and observing the handsome wood paneling of the office, an FBI agent appeared at my door with an announcement. He put before me a piece of paper asking my authorization for the installation of a wiretap without a court order. And he waited for my approval. For close to 40 years in the Department of Justice, the department had been called upon to undertake electronic surveillance in certain cases without prior judicial approval. But I thought it was a bit unusual that I was expected to sign so automatically, he said, if that was really the expectation. I asked the agent to leave the request with me, I think perhaps to his surprise, so that I could consult other officials in the department. This experience was one of many that led us to explore the question of how procedures could be perfected in this world of inevitable secrecy. Just by the way, a personal note, he told me that story, or some version of it, when he asked me to come to Washington to work with him. But the secrecy was so difficult, and Edward, being Edward, I didn't understand a word that he said. But electronic surveillance was only one of the challenges that recent history had set before him. Levi was the 5th Attorney General in 6 years. 2 of his 4 predecessors had ended up convicted of crimes related to the Watergate. Former acting head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, L. Patrick Gray, had resigned when it was revealed that less than a week after the break-in at the offices of the Democratic National Headquarters, he had received documents from the safe of the leader of the burglars. The White House counsel had told him that they should never see the light of day, so Gray burned them in a fireplace. The former head of the department's Internal Security Division was under indictment for activities while serving in Nixon's re-election campaign. Though the FBI, despite Gray, had been instrumental in the investigation of the burglary, the scandal and its aftermath, as well as unrelated leaks of FBI documents, revealed information about a variety of the Bureau's previously secret programs to spy on and disrupt domestic political groups thought by the Bureau to be subversive. As Levi took office, congressional investigations geared up to look into the FBI and other federal intelligence organizations. Electronic surveillance without a warrant, especially when agents had to break and enter in order to place a microphone, was under particular scrutiny, the Supreme Court in 1972 having ruled it unconstitutional in domestic security cases, that is, those involving spying, not involving spying, subversion, or terrorism by a foreign power. Also deeply controversial were the FBI's so-called COINTELPRO operations, in which agents tried various schemes to make life difficult for individuals and groups as various as the Socialist Workers' Party, Dr. Martin Luther King, and anti-Vietnam War activists. Levi said a number of times in speeches and congressional testimony that some of these operations were outrageous and the others were foolish. Within weeks of becoming Attorney General, Levi had revealed to a committee of the House of Representatives a summary of the contents of the long-feared secret files of the late FBI Director, J. Edgar Hoover. The files were mostly routine and administrative, but those that were salacious justified the fears. As the Watergate scandals and their aftermath played out, the percentage of Americans who said they had a highly favorable view of the FBI fell from 84% to 37%. And it was not only the FBI that was thrown into doubt. The press reported that the Central Intelligence Agency had for more than 20 years intercepted and opened mail between United States citizens and residents of the Soviet Union, and that the National Security Agency had a list of Americans whose international telecommunications it monitored. As Levi often said, it was as if the country were reliving decades of Cold War history all at once without remembering the sense of danger. Still, it became clear to Levi that many of the government's intelligence activities had been undertaken without a thought to the law. Not long into his service as Attorney General, he and a few of his colleagues went to visit the NSA, the super secret organization that monitors international communications and decrypts coded messages. After we were shown an array of dazzling, ultra-secret technologies, the head of the agency gave a briefing. During it, Levi asked to be provided with the memoranda in the files discussing the Fourth Amendment implications of NSA's activities. When the NSA director asked his general counsel if he could think of any reason this couldn't be done, the lawyer paused for a moment, then said he couldn't provide them because there were none. The constitutional question simply had never been asked. As the congressional investigations got underway, there were multiple demands for documents from the files of the intelligence agencies. Some of these documents carried the highest possible security clearance classifications, and usually for good reasons. There was intense resistance when Levi asserted that the decision whether and under what circumstance to disclose these matters belonged to the Justice Department, which might have to defend in court any decision to invoke executive privilege. Executive privilege, like many other legal doctrines, had been discredited by misuse by the Nixon administration, but a good number of people in the intelligence community had not yet appreciated its fragility. At one meeting of the deputy directors of the intelligence agencies of all the intelligence agencies that I attended as Levy's representative, a senior FBI official bristled at the very idea of any disclosure of one particular spying operation. That is something, he said, we can't even tell the president about. Well, there was going to be none of that, I can assure you. Levi prevailed, and many documents, although by no means all, were provided. Some turned over to the committee staffs, others given only to the senators and representatives and not to their staffs. Still others only shown or described to committee chairmen. This did not satisfy everyone in Congress, of course, and there were calls to subpoena executive officials and hold them in contempt if they failed to provide the documents demanded. There was even a suggestion that a recalcitrant executive official might be seized and put in jail in the Capitol building. The rancorous atmosphere pervaded everything, but it was the FBI that Levi felt the strongest about. He felt the greatest responsibility both to reform and to defend. The Bureau was part of the Department of Justice, but it had learned during the J. Edgar Hoover years to resist the kind of direction and accountability that other parts of the department just took for granted. The first order of business then was to begin a process of integration, and the key figure in this was FBI Director Clarence Kelly. A great bear of a man, Kelly had once been an FBI agent, then had moved on to become chief of police in Kansas City before being appointed by Richard Nixon to run an organization still churning in the wake of Hoover's death. Not long after working with Kelly on the disclosure of Hoover's secret files, Levi paid him a visit in his office, which was then still on the same floor as the Attorney General's in the main Justice Department building. As Levi and a few others entered, Kelly greeted the Attorney General with a convivial slap on the back that almost sent Levi flying. We sat down at a conference table, and through the window we could see the dome of the Capitol lighted up in the night sky. Levi told Kelly that he knew that they both understood that there would have to be changes in the Bureau. In making them, he said, "You can work with all those lions," he said, pointing to the Capitol, "or this little mouse." That meeting was the beginning of a process that would transform not only the relationship between the FBI and the Attorney General, but the very manner in which the Bureau carried out its most sensitive investigations. Levi appointed a committee to draft investigative guidelines in a number of areas, most importantly, domestic security, foreign intelligence, and foreign counterintelligence. The domestic security guidelines for the first time required the FBI to disclose to a special unit reporting to the Attorney General all full-scale domestic security investigations, to provide specific and articulable facts giving reason to believe that the subject of an investigation had or was going to violently violate the law. When the evidence failed to meet this standard, the investigation had to close. The application of the guidelines put an end to numerous investigations of political groups, including a 40-year pursuit of the Socialist Workers' Party, when agents of the FBI could find no evidence in the Bureau's voluminous files showing that the groups had violated or were going to violate any law. During the first 9 months after the guidelines went into effect, the number of active domestic security investigations declined from 5,000 to fewer than 300. The provisions of the guidelines have been revised numerous times over the years since. Sometimes they've been eviscerated, sometimes revived. In 2011, the FBI made public a new Domestic Investigations and Operations Guide. Though heavily redacted and extremely detailed, it seemed to follow the basic structure of the original Levi guidelines. Significantly, it states that, quote, "Rigorous obedience to constitutional principles and guarantees is more important than the outcome of any single interview, search for evidence, or investigation." Beyond domestic security matters, the two most vexing FBI issues after Watergate were electronic surveillance and what came to be known as preventive action. Now, whether FBI agents should take positive steps to prevent violence may to many, if not most Americans today, seem hardly a question. But at the time, the Bureau's COINTELPRO history gave it a very different color than it has now in a world on guard against terrorist attacks on a terrible mass level. Under the rubric of COINTELPRO, too often the Bureau had engaged in dirty tricks and worse, directed against domestic dissident political groups simply to make their dissent more difficult. Nonetheless, the committee drafting domestic security guidelines included a section providing for, but severely restricting, preventive action. In the end, Levi eliminated this section, probably for fear that it would undermine the acceptance of the rest of the guidelines by Congress and the public. The effort, after all, as he fully understood, was not only to balance security and civil liberties, but also to secure a degree of public confidence in the balance struck. Electronic surveillance and other intrusive searches without warrants were even more complicated to deal with. The federal statutes authorizing judges to issue wiretap and microphone surveillance warrants had been drafted with a view to the investigation and prosecution of criminal cases. They were unsuited to cases involving ongoing surveillance of, for example, Soviet spies, where the objective was to monitor clandestine activity in order to defend against it, not to arrest someone. Neither did the existing law fit the cases in which surveillance was intended to gather information about a foreign government's plans and intentions, for example, monitoring a Cold War adversary's communications from within the United States back home. Without a statute providing a warrant procedure suitable to the purpose, the government had to rely on the president's inherent power, which had been delegated to the Attorney General. Simply calling a final halt to foreign intelligence and counterintelligence surveillance was too dangerous to consider, despite the disrepute into which it had fallen. And it was not only Congress and the skeptical public that questioned the legitimacy of warrantless surveillance. Though the Supreme Court had been careful not to cast doubt on the president's authority when a foreign power was involved, 4 of 9 justices of the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia, sitting on bank in 1975, suggested that all warrantless electronic surveillances and physical intrusive searches were unconstitutional. Levy's response was, you won't be surprised from hearing the previous talks, was to discuss the matter publicly and thoroughly, most notably in testimony before the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. That was and remains a remarkable performance, given that he was signing surveillance orders that critics, including influential federal judges, said violated constitutional rights, which meant that signing them may have turned out to be a criminal civil rights violation. Edward used to joke to me darkly that we would have a very long time together in a prison cell to discuss what had led us to be so wrong about the law. Henry Kissinger was also involved in authorizing the surveillances. One evening, Edward overheard Kissinger expatiating to an admiring crowd at a reception that it was impossible for a statesman to find the time to think original thoughts. Edward turned to him and observed that much great political thinking had been done in jail. This characteristically sharp-tongued remark may help explain Kissinger's later behavior, which I'll describe in just a minute. Despite the personal risks that Levy faced and the poisonousness of the political atmosphere, his testimony on electronics surveillance did not mount a full-throated defense of presidential power, though he did defend it. Instead, he delivered a learned and nuanced examination of the development of the law of search and seizure in England and the United States, spoke of the important values in play on all sides, and explained the standards and procedures he applied in deciding whether to authorize a surveillance without a warrant. I believe most fair-minded people would find this testimony extraordinary if they understood the context. Though complicated, the statement made clear the importance of the conflicting national needs and values. The testimony, all 61 pages of which Levy delivered to the committee orally, stands as an example of intellectual honesty under pressure. It's a valuable model to the present day. Later, Levy designed a proposed law to create a special court to issue national security surveillance warrants. The Carter administration put forth a variant of this proposal, which passed in 1978. It was the failure to use this procedure to provide judicial warrants for NSA's sweeping post-9/11 surveillance that ignited a new wave of controversy and led to the statute's amendment in 2007. By the way, in defending his proposed statute to provide a warrant in these cases, Levy supported the continued viability of inherent presidential power because, as he said in congressional testimony, quote, "It is conceivable that there may be unprecedented, unforeseen circumstances of the utmost danger not contemplated in the legislation, which restrictions unintentionally could bring to paralysis." As Levy worked through the process of explaining, regularizing, and legitimizing warrantless electronic surveillance involving foreign powers and their agents, FBI investigators discovered in a safe in the Bureau's New York field office a file entitled, incredibly enough, "Do Not File." The "Do Not File" file, as we came to know it, included documentation on numerous break-ins undertaken in domestic cases, such as the pursuit of weather underground fugitives, without a warrant or the approval of the Attorney General. Levy opened a criminal investigation into these break-ins. This did not sit well with the old-timers in the FBI. At one point, they responded in kind by sending agents to interrogate the members of Levy's FBI security detail about Levy's own activities. By the way, just as a parenthetical and an example of how far the Bureau changed after this time, the man who led the security detail at that time ordered his agents not to answer the FBI's questions. That man who was an inspector, later became the deputy director of the FBI, and for a time its acting director. The Bureau had changed fundamentally. Within the Ford administration, Levy's interpretation of the president's letter to the Attorney General delegating him the power to authorize warrantless surveillance, too came under intense pressure. At one point, he refused to permit one very significant category of surveillance to continue. He did so because the procedures established by the president required that with respect to that category, either the Secretary of State or the President's National Security Advisor had to certify that the intelligence being sought was important to the nation's security before the Attorney General could approve the surveillance. Suddenly, Henry Kissinger, who held both positions, stopped certifying. But at the same time, he demanded that Levy authorize the surveillance. One day, Levy was summoned to the White House to meet with the president and Kissinger. Kissinger attacked Levy's position. Levy explained it. Meeting ended without resolution. Ford asked Levy to stay behind as the meeting broke up. "Don't give an inch, Ed," Ford said. Not long afterwards, Ford replaced Kissinger as his national security advisor, which obviated the problem. Edward called me the morning that story broke in the paper and said, "Did we do that?" I said, "Man, if you don't know, I surely don't." Not long afterwards, Ford's support was essential to Levy's work, and he gave it. He had hired Levy to make the changes necessary to end the crisis of legitimacy, and he didn't balk when Levy did just that. The president was supportive in many ways. For example, he accepted Levy's recommendation that the administration propose a law placing stricter controls on handguns. The crime rate at the time was alarming, but the balance of political risk weighed heavily against trying to advance a gun control bill against the entrenched sentiments and interests that had defeated it and those who proposed it so many times before. In a meeting in the cabinet room in the White House, in which Levy's team presented the gun control proposal, Ford's political advisors were indignantly opposed. But in the end, Ford asked, "Ed, could this save lives?" And Levy replied that it might, and Ford gave the go-ahead. No Republican in the Senate would agree to introduce the bill. Senator Edward Kennedy did instead. And as Levy was entering the Senate Judiciary Committee to testify on the bill, where the Klieg lights were on and the reporters were all gathered and the cameras were running, a call came from the White House political office telling him to call off his testimony. He went ahead anyway. Needless to say, the bill didn't pass, and it didn't help President Ford's reelection campaign. During his time in the Department of Justice, Levy also dealt with many other controversial questions, among them compulsory school busing for racial balance and the constitutionality of campaign finance laws. In these two matters, and as in so many others, he declined to accept the conventional politically polarized choices initially presented to him. When people questioned this kind or criticized this kind of independence of thought, Levy was fond of repeating a quotation of Lord Devlin. "It would not be good for judges to act executively," the British jurist wrote. "It is better to expect executives to act judicially." Even in matters that passed without any public notice, Levy questioned relentlessly. One example was the arcane matter of dual prosecutions, which can occur when a single act violates both a federal and a state law. A defendant is tried under the state law, and federal prosecutors want to try the defendant again under federal law. Despite the constitutional rule against double jeopardy, dual prosecutions have been permitted by the federal courts. Under Justice Department policy, Levy had to decide whether to authorize a second prosecution in every case. Each time he agonized over what principle might apply. And I can assure you that he forced everyone who worked with him to agonize as well. He often quoted Walter Bagehot, recommending government by discussion. And he led the Justice Department in a way that followed the advice. Even the most lonely decisions, he did not make alone. I recall one day vividly when Levi summoned me urgently to his office. When I got there, I found that Solicitor General Robert Bork, Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Counsel Antonin Scalia, and Consular to the Attorney General Douglas Marvin had gotten there before me. Levi handed me a document. It was an FBI memorandum reporting an allegation that President Ford had violated the law in one of his election campaigns in Michigan while he served as a member of the House of Representatives. During the course of the intense discussion in Levi's office, the question that emerged was whether to deal with the allegation within the ordinary processes of the Justice Department or to refer it to the Watergate Special Prosecutor's Office, which was still finishing up its work involving the Nixon administration. The rule establishing the Special Prosecutor's Office was unclear as to whether an allegation like this had to be referred. In the end, Levi decided to submit the allegation to the Special Prosecutor and to tell no one in the White House, including the President, that he had done so. Subpoenas in the case went out shortly after President Ford won nomination for an elected term. The allegation exploded into the news. A lot of people in the White House exploded too. There were news reports that Levi was on the way out. But that was not the way Gerald Ford saw it. Though eventually the special prosecutor ended his investigation without taking legal action, which was no surprise to any of us who had seen the nature of the allegation in the first place. The publicity undoubtedly didn't help Ford in his election campaign. Yet, when it was all over, and the president finally felt that it was appropriate to speak of the matter, he said that his Attorney General had, in his view, done exactly the right thing. I'd like to close with a quotation from a talk Levi gave at Boston College in September of 1975. You won't be surprised, having heard the earlier talks today, that he used public speaking as a very important way to rethink, reframe, revive, and reform a culture, in this case, a culture of federal law and federal law enforcement. This speech, the Boston College speech, seems to me particularly pertinent at this moment in our history. I'll quote it. "The unity of our diversity is extraordinary and difficult to achieve," he said. "A free society, a government by discussion, requires mutual respect. It requires mutual understanding. It requires a culture held in common, a culture not unitary but composed of many differences. The base for understanding must be built and rebuilt over time." The talk concluded by quoting Thomas Carlyle, that history is a book that all men write and read and try to understand, and in which they too are written. Always ahead of us, Levi said, was the infinite task of completing the text. I'm pretty sure that were Edward here with us today, he would recognize the situation the country is in, not liking it, but asking us to keep at the infinite task. Thank you very much.
We've pretty much used up the time allotted for the session this morning. I wonder if any of the members of the panel want to add any thoughts, having heard one another. And if you don't, I'll call on you in Edward's spirit.
Do law students still, have they changed back again? The culture of law students approaching law? No.
I think it's worse. That'd be another session, and it's worse today. I mean, the professionalism
or the business, it's a lot of pressures. The cost of law school and the career they enter into is not what it was. So I think it's a struggle for legal education to figure out how to recapture, what, as I say, I think I caught the tail end of. And because we don't exist in isolation and the outside pressures, if anything, are pushing in the other direction now.
I don't agree with that, actually. That may be Stanford. But no, honestly, at Chicago, my sense is that the students are surprisingly motivated by a desire to use their interest in the law in personal, positive, public-oriented ways. And there are obviously major financial pressures on them, particularly coming from debt, to earn some money. But I think the students are very different today than they were in the early 80s, where there was so much internally driven by the professionalism, the financial aspects of it. But I don't see that today at all.
Well, as I say, I think that would be a topic for a different session, so I won't, but well, yeah, let me just, we'll talk later.
Yes.
There's one thing that emerges in all of the presentations today, and that's a belief that Edward Levy had in discussion, talking it through. Don't pick between two, radical points of view. Try to refine, pick on basis of principle, make sure you refine the question, get all the evidence that you can, don't make snap judgments, and convince yourself, and by convincing yourself, you'll convince others. I mean, he was all of the piece, I think, in the way his mind worked in that way. And as you say, that's what he was teaching, too. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the point Jack finished on is the striking one, which is, so Edward would be a representative of something that has just vanished today, right? A moderate Republican who believed in compromise as the core value of democratic society. I mean, and that's what that speech is about, and so many other speeches of the need to compromise. So he's Attorney General coming out of Watergate when the Democrats are looking a lot like today's Republicans, but it's all about getting back and wanting to use the power of government to make a point and not really speaking to the other side. And the constant theme in all of those speeches is on the essential nature of compromise, talking, listening, recognizing that we have diverse interests that have to be accommodated with each other in a democratic society. And so it was striking to read them, just how powerful that sounds.
Yeah, I ought to point out, Larry wrote a lovely preface to this volume. It's going to be out in the spring.
In terms of, by the way, the legacy and the impact, just a personal note, I now teach the Elements course in the law school, and my students read substantial excerpts from an introduction to legal reasoning, and I teach the course very much through the vision of Edward Levy, although not 2,000 pages. But I think that continues to be an important resource and an important theme in terms of how we introduce students to the law.
Well, particularly what he captures so well is this emphasis on process. It's not application of rules, it's a development, it's a questioning, it's a comparison, it's a weighing of advantages, consequences, principles, and the like. That's the great strength of the work.
So I think with that, we've basically used up our time allotted to us. We'll take a break and reconvene for the afternoon session at 2 o'clock. At 2 o'clock. Thank you.